Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents NATO, From Cold War to Ukraine, A History of the World's Most Powerful Alliance, by Sten Rynning, narrated by Kleinman. Introduction. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In February 2022, Russia's President Putin committed a breach of civilization when he unleashed a devastating war in an effort to remove Ukraine's right to exist independently. In so doing, he brought NATO back to life as a defensive shield against external aggression. That was why NATO had been created back in 1949. But like everyone else, President Putin was aware of how in recent years the organization had lost its geopolitical mojo. U.S. President Obama had dithered on NATO leadership, and then President Trump had sent a wrecking ball smashing into its diplomacy. Gloom set in on the European side, and French President Macron declared the alliance brain-dead. To cap it all, in August 2021, the Taliban kicked NATO out of Afghanistan. Perhaps, therefore, by breaking Ukraine's statehood, President Putin could also break NATO. Yet for all his cunning, Putin remained one step behind the late Paul-Henri Spaak. A Belgian statesman who served as both Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of his country, he had been present at the birth of NATO, and in 1956 was appointed the organization's Secretary-General. Spaak had an intuitive feel for NATO's special character. No other alliance in history had had such a deep commitment to consultation among free countries. None had been likewise fueled by the desire to live in freedom and security. To distill this character into words, Spaak teamed up with André de Stark, Belgium's ambassador to NATO, who impressively would stay in post for 26 years. Spaak and de Stark it was who gave NATO its motto, which drew on the history and staying power of the Roman Empire. Animus in consulendo liber, in consultation among free spirits. To seasoned leaders, NATO's motto is hard to miss. It was first written on the wall of the conference hall of NATO's Paris headquarters at Porte Dauphine, a building in the shape of an A for Alliance, which opened in 1959. It was then placed inside the main conference chamber of NATO's Brussels headquarters, both in the original headquarters of 1967 and in the new one of 2017. Following a quarrel with fellow NATO leaders over the Middle East, President Nixon once brutally told the Allies that consultations were not a legally binding obligation. Nixon was right, but the point of NATO's character and the motto is not about legality. It is about the political nature of being free and in alliance. It is about how NATO's exercise of power is restrained because of the alliance's free spirits, and how the wisdom of free counsel makes for enduring power. And it is about how NATO, because of these qualities, continues to attract new member allies and partners. NATO's story is the exercise of power guided by free thinking. That is what this book is about. It is about how NATO was set up in 1949 to create peace for its community. It is about how this vision at times has been more than the NATO allies could handle. And it is about how NATO today must recalibrate its vision to encompass a new struggle for global order. Why is NATO important? NATO's vision of being free and allied contrasts with the Eurasian vision of President Vladimir Putin's Russia or the Sino-centric vision of President Xi Jinping's China. Essentially, NATO was and remains a testbed for the geopolitical relevance of Western values. What happens next to NATO is of concern to everyone. NATO lies at the heart of Europe's security order, and that is no small matter. President Putin has effectively declared war on it, with the purpose of ultimately denying Ukraine the right to choose NATO and NATO the right to choose Ukraine. Next to Russia stands Xi Jinping's China. Their no-limits friendship falls short of Chinese military assistance in the Ukraine war, but highlights the growing alignment of the two powers in opposition to the United States and NATO. According to China, the war of attrition in Ukraine is a result not of Russia's attack, but of how NATO's 5 consecutive rounds of eastward expansion have violated Russia's legitimate security demands. In the face of this assault on Europe's order, the NATO allies have had to go back to square one so as to define their principles for order and provide the military muscle required to protect that order. NATO is the vehicle by which the Western allies, beginning with the United States, but involving all 32 countries, will invite Ukraine into an enhanced security partnership and eventually into their alliance. It is a new order for NATO, and it is not just about Ukraine. It encompasses the entire NATO frontier, which, as a direct result of Russia's war, now includes Finland and soon Sweden. The Allies must build up their military capacity to protect and defend this entire territory. Before Russia launched its war in February 2022, the Allies did not really take this matter too seriously. Now they do. But forward defense, the ability to defend at the very frontier of NATO territory, requires enormous political military effort, and it is around the table of the North Atlantic Council, NATO's decision-making chamber, that this effort will be shaped. NATO allies have faced similar challenges before, but something has changed. Power is no longer shifting in the West's favor, as it did in 1949 when NATO was founded, or in 1990 to 91 when the Soviet Union, NATO's Cold War adversary, disintegrated. China is the rising power, and it exudes the confidence of a rising power. The Western allies, by contrast, seem hesitant, unsure of how they can build a sustainable order in the face of adversity. They have provided considerable aid to Ukraine, but they have also restricted that aid in order to prevent an escalation. This pattern of significant but limited assistance comes after a decade of indecision. The bruising war on terror led the Allies to seek to extricate themselves from wars in faraway countries so as to carry out nation-building at home. Though their policy styles differed considerably, Presidents Obama and Trump shared this agenda. Other Allied leaders likewise became introverted, expecting others to do the hard lifting for the NATO collective. And so, as China rose and Russia fulminated, NATO weakened. Historically, the NATO allies have responded to international opportunity not with timidity, but with a degree of overconfidence. In 1949 they aimed high, as indeed they did again in 1990 to 91. In both instances they offered to transform international relations into something better. In the 1950s, this high-minded aspiration fueled a competition among the leading allies over the political spoils of leadership. Half a century later, it led the Allies to undertake a vast and impossible mission to build a society for the Afghan government they had sponsored. The Allies set up NATO to exercise power with restraint, but they have not always had the wisdom to do so. And there is a risk that the Allies will once again bite off more than they can chew, only this time in a confrontation with Russia and China. For Americans, NATO remains a critical resource of sustained international leadership. The alliance is a hub of growing attraction for allies and partners committed to the international order. When it has utilized NATO's complex multinational diplomacy, the United States has been able to win high-quality policy reflection, consensus, and resilient security commitments. Whenever the country has ignored NATO consultations, it has typically suffered. NATO helps the United States guide the exercise of power by free and pluralist counsel, and it helps U.S. decision-makers mobilize greater force than the country could manage on its own. For Europeans, NATO is just as important, but for different reasons. Europe has a wealth of nations and free counsel, but it cannot exercise power collectively. NATO, not the European Union, EU, is where European allies can have multiple voices and exercise real military power alongside their American ally. At heart, Europe's peace is built on America's extended nuclear deterrent. To imagine Europe's strategic autonomy independent of that deterrent is to deny military reality. Russia's predilection for hard power is there to remind the European allies that if NATO did not exist, they would have to invent it. What is NATO? Like NATO's motto, NATO's founding document, the North Atlantic Treaty, builds on the relationship between the spirit of freedom and the staying power of political communities. The treaty itself is short, is written in plain language, and conveys a clear message that NATO seeks to exercise power in the service of a higher aspiration of freedom and peace. Aspiration is NATO's DNA. The treaty refers to the 12 countries that signed the treaty on April 4, 1949, simply as parties to this treaty. Tellingly, it is a far cry from the traditional language of European statecraft, which would have invoked high contracting parties, excellencies, extraordinary envoys, ambassadors, and so on. NATO was meant to be different. The alliance was for the people and communities of the North Atlantic area. It was not a classical tool of state power. It puts collective defense in the service of public betterment. Thus, it is committed to freedom, democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, preamble. It seeks to strengthen free institutions, promote conditions of stability and well-being, and eliminate conflict in international economic policies, Article 2. And it is open to expanding the alliance to any other European state in a position to further these values, Article 10. Remarkably, the North Atlantic Treaty speaks of no evil. The Allies were barely 4 years out of a world war that had been waged against an axis of revisionist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they were entering a Cold War with the Communist Soviet Union. But at no point do the Allies single out one or more threatening countries or menacing ideologies. Instead, the treaty aligns itself with the United Nations, the Organization for World Cooperation that came into being in 1945. The first sentence of the preamble reaffirms the values of the UN Charter. The Allies promise not to act in a way that runs counter to the Charter, Article 1. They promise to exercise individual and collective self-defense in line with the Charter, Article 5. And they affirm that their treaty does not in any way affect the obligations and responsibilities established under the UN Charter, Article 7. If inclusive and global security under the United Nations is the ultimate goal, NATO pursues it by protecting its own North Atlantic community from outside aggression. That is, NATO is about defense, but in the service of broader security aspirations. Articles 3 to 6 describe how this works. Article 3 commits every ally to a defense effort. In other words, the alliance is not a U.S. dependency, but a collective effort. Article 4 offers every ally the right to seek Allied support if it feels threatened. With this clause, the Allies can put NATO on alert and flex its muscles to forestall an impending armed attack. Should such an attack occur, Article 5 commits all the Allies to take action to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Article 5's obligation of solidarity is clear and obvious, but it leaves it up to each ally to define the appropriate and necessary action. Article 6 defines the geography of this commitment. It covers armed attacks on Allied territories in Europe and North America, as well as on Allied forces, vessels, and aircraft in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. Political management and guidance are dealt with in 2 articles. Article 8 obliges the Allies not to undertake any commitments or engagements that could conflict with the NATO treaty. Thus, if a European ally felt the need to make the EU a defense mechanism, that could well conflict with the NATO treaty. Likewise, the United States cannot enter into any bilateral agreement with the North Atlantic area, say with Britain, Poland, or any other ally that would take precedence over its NATO obligations. Article 9 describes how NATO should take decisions. It defines a permanent council, later the North Atlantic Council, NAC, to consider all matters relevant to the treaty. This should have the capacity to meet promptly at any time. The Council, the treaty continues, must set up a defense committee to support it, and it may set up other subsidiary bodies. In due course, this provision led the Allies to create a wider political military arrangement that provided the NAT, North Atlantic Treaty, with a concluding O, organization. Because the treaty was regarded as being in the service of freedom and peace, the Allies felt no need to fix an expiration date. In principle, the treaty's duration is indefinite. However, the Allies did build in both a review clause and an exit clause. Once the treaty had been in force for 10 years, any ally might, in light of global or regional developments, call for a review of it, Article 12. In effect, the treaty has been revised only twice, on the accession of Greece and Turkey, and on the independence of Algeria from France. Both revisions concerned the territory to which the treaty referred. The exit clause stipulates that once the treaty has been in force for 20 years, any ally can withdraw from it with 1 year's notice, Article 13. No country has ever left NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty was thus geographically bounded. Its collective defense clause applied to the North Atlantic area, and prospective members had to be European. But it was also politically unbounded. Allies can consult on any issue of global order, and they must consider all issues, not just military issues, that threaten their values, free institutions, and well-being. What this meant in practice was then up to NATO governments as they consulted and exercised power. How to think about NATO. In December 1988, U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz attended his final North Atlantic Council meeting. Having been present at such meetings since 1982, he had had a good innings, and his NATO colleagues wanted to show their appreciation. On behalf of their collective, Italian Foreign Minister Giulio Andreotti offered Shultz a gift, a small model train dubbed the NATO train. In a subsequent letter of good wishes to Andreotti, Shultz explained how the NATO train had become a big hit in Washington. He had taken it to a private meeting with President Reagan, who was fascinated by it. "We ended up," wrote Shultz, "spending an inordinate amount of time playing with it." It is tempting to read into this type of anecdote how the NATO allies have a special bond. They offer each other gifts and play with them. They quarrel, but at the end of the day they patch things up, thanks to a unifying thread of political, economic, and private exchanges that extends across centuries. NATO leaders and officials regularly invoke this bond in the service of common values or a shared commitment to democracy. NATO's latest strategy speaks of freedom and democracy, and in 2022, President Biden said it is simply the way of the world that every generation must defeat democracy's mortal foes. Some analysts agree that the NATO allies benefit from a special bond. Shared values and a democratic willingness to compromise keep NATO on track, and institutional ties, that is, NATO itself, help the democracies keep their values of compromise in focus. It follows from this long view of embedded values that NATO is enduring, but must still adapt. Thus, if a global conflict erupts and threatens democracy, the alliance must build a global security web or even transform itself into a global NATO. It follows also that the NATO allies may have enduring values, yet still get their policies wrong. They fought too long and too hard in Afghanistan. Yet despite this failure, NATO continues to operate on valiant ideas of freedom and democracy. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was but a stark reminder that democracy is worth fighting for. The United States is in NATO to fight for freedom in Europe. The Europeans must increasingly realize that they should be ready to fight for it in the Indo-Pacific region. Not everyone agrees, though. Some analysts think that, far from being valiant, NATO's liberal ideals are distortive or even corruptive. That is, liberal ideals may cause policymakers to chase dreams and ignore the realities of power. Some analysts claim that this is what happened in the case of NATO's enlargement. They believe that the Soviet and later Russian leaders got a raw deal at the end of the Cold War. NATO leaders promised them a spirit of cooperation, but instead expanded NATO. In the end, this teed Russia and NATO up for conflict and, ultimately, an armed contest for influence, which is what came to be played out in Ukraine in 2022. According to this line of reasoning, President Bush Sr. and President Clinton forgot that in victory, the defeated adversary, Russia, should be treated with magnanimity. If they wanted NATO to expand, which they did, they should have taken the process to its logical conclusion of including Russia. So why did the United States not do this? Essentially, some argue, because its political elite is a blob that keeps doing the same thing. The literature mostly focuses on the Washington elite, but NATO supposedly works in the same way, as a band of multinational elites who fear public retribution for their costly security choices, and who band together in NATO to survive politically. Some believe the problem is manageable and can be resolved through less self-absorbed leadership within NATO. Others consider the problem so intractable that they want America to abandon NATO and leave the alliance to the Europeans. These critics have a point. Liberal values can lead to aspirational overreach, but analysts tend to portray values as either inherently good or inherently bad. The debate is mostly conducted in black and white. There is little room for shades. But NATO is all about shades. It is about how free counsel can restrain power. NATO's history is not one of total success or resounding failure. It is a history of how free counsel is empowering, but hard to organize, and of how the exercise of power sometimes benefits from heeding sage counsel, but sometimes fails to listen. This is the history of NATO, and importantly it is forged at the level of NATO, rather than simply in one capital or another. Critics who want the United States to pull out of Europe, or Europe to liberate itself from American tutelage, or who simply want to change the Euro-Atlantic order and make it more diverse or multipolar, sweep aside the historical evidence of NATO as a collective. Most see NATO as an American tool, but in their dislike of U.S. policy, they overlook how important the alliance is as a forum for the building of partnerships. NATO is where U.S. diplomats can get a sense of the lay of the land, where they can anticipate Allied thinking, and where they can probe the repercussions for the U.S.'s wider interests before they push a particular policy. NATO is thus a place where European and Canadian ideas matter, and where continental experiences meet and sometimes merge. Another critical point is the degree to which this debate lets Russia off the hook. If NATO is a runaway train of Western American expansion, then Russia's ideas and actions, such as its war on Ukraine, can be excused. However, history shows that there's been plenty of scope for Russian ideas to make themselves heard, and that in Europe, as elsewhere, it takes two to tango. From the early 1990s, NATO began to change considerably. It grew noticeably softer, becoming politically more open and militarily less strong. Allied forces downsized and were retooled for security missions in faraway countries. There was no collective NATO military command structure or facilities planted on the territory of new allies. NATO also offered Russia a significant partnership, but in exchange for NATO's military weakening, Russia was meant to democratize. That was the deal, but the critics overlook this. They disregard the way in which Putin's Russia developed revanchist ideas, how it began to manipulate external conflicts to its own political ends, and how it sought the subjugation of smaller nations in a new policy of continental revision. To grasp NATO's evolution and endurance, to comprehend how it has weathered crisis after crisis and still prevailed, and to understand both why it stuck around after the Cold War ended and why it offered Russian partnership rather than membership, we must look deep into NATO's idea. Some might say its soul. An alliance is shaped by many things: geography, military power, the number of allies, the game of the adversary, and perhaps the fortunes of war. The premise of this book is that the sum of all this is intelligible only if we grasp the idea that inspires government and people to invest in power. To study power is to interpret the idea that motivates it. To study NATO is to study the idea of the West and the will of political leaders to mold it into political order. This book is therefore largely a political history. It will refer to military strategy, but its emphasis will be on politico-strategic debate within NATO. Such an inquiry must begin inside NATO. In this book, NATO is not a facet of some mysterious outside force, whether global capitalism, U.S. imperialism, or something else. Rather, and very straightforwardly, NATO is what the NATO allies decide and what the NATO-mandated diplomats or soldiers subsequently do. In terms of sources, the bedrock of the book will therefore be NATO archives, documents, and recorded statements. NATO archives are opened only after 30 years, and even then, only if the Allied governments agree, which means that at some point the archived sources run dry. Nevertheless, there is a lot there, and I have had access to all declassified NATO archives. Of course, NATO decision-makers and officials also continue to make public statements, and in addition, I have had the pleasure and privilege of speaking both on and off the record with many of them, both specifically for this book, and more generally over the course of my more than 20 years of research on NATO. There is a lot outside NATO that goes into its decision-making. I rely on Lawrence Friedman, who, in his magisterial history of the United States and the Middle East, wrote, "I know of no better approach than to consider the available evidence in an effort to sort out the sequence of events and the influences on decisions. In so doing, I stand on the shoulders of many gifted colleagues who have researched the historical drama of NATO. While the book's bibliography cannot do full justice to the richness of the field, it is a guide for the curious. That said, the book is also a book of novel interpretation, of NATO's pattern and what it means today. A few thoughts about this grander perspective are in order before the story begins. NATO's future must not resemble its past. NATO's character has led to a certain recurring pattern in its history, in that the alliance has twice undergone a cycle of ambition and crisis. If NATO is to continue, this pattern must change, and change will require leadership. NATO's character has emerged from two great ideational sources: Europe's history and its experience of war and peace, and America's experience of war and peace. There is little similarity between them. Europe has many states, has experienced many wars, and its states have historically sought to limit war by building alliances in order to balance power, and by using diplomatic finesse to adjust that balance. Meanwhile, North America has one dominant state, the United States, which has successfully fought wars to secure its continental peace, and which has then asserted the universal relevance of its values. NATO leadership is about balancing, and at best, integrating these different continental experiences and ideas in order to give the alliance direction. We can thus begin to trace NATO's historical pattern. It has had two moments of great ambition, in 1949 when the organization first came into being, and in 1990 to 91 when the Soviet adversary collapsed. Both moments of overweening ambition were followed by crises of power and confidence, which led the Allies to search for pragmatic compromises to shore up their alliance. This pattern results from America's historical experience of aiming high, of going overseas not to balance power, but to build an Atlantic community within which war would be inconceivable. The pattern also results from Europe's legacy of contesting the practicality of grand ambition. In Europe, the reality of political pluralism churns ambition into pragmatism. And so, this is NATO, an alliance created to aim high, but destined to struggle with the practicality of aspiration. The book is organized to demonstrate this pattern. Part 1 covers the early years of original and high aspiration. It brings us back to the years of the Second World War and the energy unleashed by the confrontation with the Axis powers, and looks at how NATO was born both as a community of peace and as a bulwark against Soviet communism and the emerging Cold War. Part 2 covers the years of pragmatism and conservatism that set in once that initial wave of political aspiration had crash-landed on the altar of national interests. NATO
Sample complete. Ready to continue?